Welcome to the Variety Streaming Room. I'm Leo Barakoff, Variety's International Features Editor, and I'm excited to moderate the panel discussion, Lost in Translation, Visual Story Development from Script to Screen. We will be hearing from masters of the Tallinn Black Nights Film Festival's Black Room, organised in association with the European Film Academy, and renowned German screenwriters from the Face-to-Face German Films programme. We will be discussing the commonly overlooked but important development process in filmmaking. Please meet Jacqueline Abrahams, production designer of such films as The Lobster and How I Live Now, Yana Burbach, writer of such shows as Bad Banks and Breaking Even, Hanno Hackford, writer of such series as You Are Wanted and Full Blogs, Simon Weiser, model maker and prop maker of such films as The Grand Budapest Hotel and Isle of Dogs. And I should add, Jacqueline and Simon are taking part in Black Room, Industry at Tallinn's training program that explores the visual language of cinema through the craft of production design. Black Room comprises 1 week of masterclasses and workshops held by world-renowned professionals, taking place during the Black Nights Film Festival. When I saw the title of this discussion, I was reminded of the difference between translating a language and interpreting it. And I thought it'd be a good way to start because translation is a little bit more literal. Interpretation requires some creativity. So maybe, Simon, you could start by saying whether there's occasions when you're just told to translate someone's instructions and when you have the opportunity to interpret and which one you prefer.
It's not easy because when you get a script first, I mean, it's not easy to make an interpretation of it. And if you have, for my work, if you have drawings with it and we speak with production designers and the directors about their idea, I can interpret an idea and see how my crew and me will build all this, because we are trying to build an artificial world in miniatures and props, but it's a long process. And even while we're working on the film, it's going on, and it's learning by doing and step by step.
Mm-hmm. And what about Jacqueline? Are there times when people give you quite literal instructions and other times when people allow you to bring your own creativity to it?
I think it definitely depends on both the filmmaker and the script, but I honestly think that it's about trust. I don't know what you think, Simon, but I think it must be terrifying if you imagine you've got a script and you have got a vision, and then you have to somehow share that with other people and hope that they're going to somehow get what you imagine, and what you imagine you might not know yet. So I think it's such a delicate journey. And I would say that it's interesting, Simon, you saying about kind of almost not necessarily knowing clearly what it is to start with. I feel like we're expected to come to an interview or discuss it as though we know what it will be. But of course, we all know that's really a charade, because the process is one where you may discover something extraordinary, even if you've storyboarded everything and you've had absolutely everything as you know. I mean, I'm always interested when people have a really strong vision from the get-go. And I often wonder whether it's possible to hold on to it completely. Maybe it is, but I've always found so many variables come into filmmaking that in a way, it's quite good to stay quite open and a bit fluid just in case, because you know, on the lower budget end, there's so many variables that you can go, I really want it to be like this, I can really see it like this, but often that's quite hard to pull off or achieve. So.
And Yana and Hanno, when you come onto a project that you haven't created, I mean, are there different approaches from the director in terms of their guidance and notes?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, like every collaboration is very sort of relationship specific. So I think there are different approaches, but as the others have said, I think it always needs to be a process and a long conversation about sort of trying to understand what the vision is. And ideally, it's not just sort of accepting dictates, but sort of like finding a vision together that you also find inspiring as a writer, and that you can bring something personal to, even if it's not your original creation. So I mean, I've worked as a staff writer a few times for shows that weren't my own, but I always really try to find something in it that I could really passionately relate to, just because I think the work ends up being better. And it's such a long journey development that I think if you're not really invested, then it can be quite hard to sort of sustain the passion all the way through.
And Hannah, have you come across different approaches from directors?
I've never worked as a staff writer, so all the shows we created, I worked together with my two colleagues, Bob and Richard, and all the stuff we've done in the recent years were shows we created.
Right.
Of course, there are different approaches even then with from directors, and but I would totally agree to the others. It's an even if you think you have a clear vision in mind while writing the show, why outline it. Once the director comes on board, or the art director comes on board, or the DOP comes on board, a discussion begins, and you have to be open to throw things overboard and to build something new within this creative group. So that's our philosophy.
And when you're writing a script, how detailed do you make various notes about stage direction, or the set, or costumes? Did you put quite a lot of detail when you created a project yourself?
Yes, usually we do, but that does not mean that it in the end it should be exactly like the things we've written down. We think that it's necessary to be, during the process of writing, to be very clear about a vision. That should not be the vision in the end, but a vision, and to make the other people understand what we mean, and then we can start a dialogue, and they say, oh, okay, now we know what you mean, but we have other opinions, or let's see it from another angle, blah 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 blah. But yes, we're very detailed in these descriptions. Yes.
Yana, where do you get your inspiration from? For example, for Bad Banks, how did you get into the world? It's based in the world of banking. How did you get into that mindset where you could imagine what they look like, how they moved, the buildings that they worked in?
Yeah, I think there was quite a complex research process that sort of involved both meeting bankers in person and sort of getting a feel for the type of characters that you might meet there, and their energy and their way of speaking. And then also just like from reading books and articles, and sort of, yeah, like understanding the material of finance a little bit. So there was like that layer. And I think like very important was also that I sort of remembered that a friend of mine's husband had been a banker. Like, he's now doing other sort of finance related things, but I remembered that he had worked in a bank. And so like we spent endless hours like listening to his anecdotes and stuff. So he was sort of quite pivotal. But then also like we did end up meeting lots of different bankers, and that sort of, I think especially the language like they use, how they interacted with us, a sense of competitiveness, a sense of aggression, even in vocabulary, was very impressive, because you could almost feel, even if they weren't in their world, but with us writers, that they had like a different pace and a different energy and a different, I think a different sense of sort of competitiveness and that you always have to be informed. Time is money. You have to speak fast, you know. So they were sometimes just like very overwhelming, and I think that was very inspiring for us.
And Hannah, where do you get your inspiration for when you're creating a new world?
I think it's the same as Yana said. We often start diving into this world. For example, for blogs, we started to speak with journalists or politicians, police people, but very soon we met people from this Arabic community in Berlin, and we dived into their world and spent a lot of time with them. And the same as Yana said, to learn how they speak, how they how they react on each other, what's their way of coping with certain problems. And yeah, that's the way I think you find inspiration there in the world you're writing about.
Mm-hmm. And Jacqueline, what helps you kind of visualize the world that you're going to help create? What things can the writers and the director give you to help you?
Well, I think it's a really interesting thing that we do when you think about it. Like, so you guys write these scripts, right? You have this idea and you help anchor the piece somewhere. And then I read what you've written and I get something that's maybe a sentiment, a feeling, a massive arc. It may be a little detail. It may be, I don't know, an emotion, or it may be just literally the structure. And I respond to that. I mean, I think it's an extraordinary thing. You know, it's like a kind of sort of weird emotional semaphore where we kind of code. I mean, like, I was thinking just when you were talking, I was thinking, imagine, you know, Dogville. Imagine getting Dogville without any stage directions. Imagine the meetings that he would have had with people going, well, I imagine it like this. And I love the idea that originally maybe they were in a particular place. And then it ended up, they said, no, let's just delineate the space in a big, you know, gymnasium. I love that came out of some mad discussion. I'm sure it didn't. I'm sure he thought, no, this is what I want. But I don't know. I suppose what I think is amazing about writing, and I've been thinking about this reading recently, thinking, God, you're reading the intimate personal thoughts, not necessarily intimate, but having been formed intimately by an individual, and you're literally just channeling what they thought when they wrote it. And I find that such a kind of interesting relationship to start with. And I do believe that you, I don't know, you pick up on lots of things from a script. It's not always the obvious things. You know, if a piece is about, I don't know, you know, gangs in the inner city, it may not be that that's the feeling you get from it. Maybe you feel that it's all about dysfunctional families, or maybe it's about the tragedy of parenting, or the fear of, or, you know, it may be that when you're reading it, something comes through. And I wonder, as writers, you know, I wonder whether, you know, we're talking about elements of chance here, and that's what I think is brilliant. Maybe there's bits that are uncontrolled when you write, and maybe they surprise you too. I mean, maybe that happens. You read something and go, God, whew. I mean, that must happen, right? So
yes,
probably
definitely.
I feel I'm picking up on all that. You know, you start the thought and I take it on with other people, and we start, you know, expanding and stretching and shrinking and doing things with that thought or those thoughts. And I think that's amazing.
And you were mentioning about how some directors now use mood books. Is that quite common?
I think it's become more common.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's you know, and maybe it's a demand from somewhere. But you know, I can't believe Lars von Trier does a mood book. But maybe you know, I can't believe someone will say, Lars, could you do us a mood book? But I do think people want to know what things are going to be. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we're more afraid of risk, then maybe we want to know more components of things. And so but sometimes it's really useful. So I'm not saying that it's never useful. Obviously, if someone has a really strong feeling about what they want something to be or feel like or look like, it's really good to know. But on the other hand, I also feel there's something weird about presenting these frozen images that have been researched, whether they're, amazing photographers from 50s America or whatever, and somehow appropriating them into a piece that's not necessarily about that, And you almost need little arrows saying, okay, I'm showing you this image because I like red and I like red with that color. And so you're already taking things apart in a weird way as well. It feels, I understand why it's necessary, because it's a way of saying who you are and what you're responding to. But again, I think it's like you guys were saying, it's almost like, yeah, you start with it, but then you might just throw it all out anyway. So maybe it's just about going, don't worry, it'll be fine.
And Simon, what do you find helpful when someone's trying to explain to you what they want you to create? I mean, for example, you were saying that the hotel in Grand Budapest Hotel is based on a real place in Karlovy Vary in the Czech Republic. Are there other examples like that?
I mean, I have been doing 3 films with Wes now, and I must say, in the beginning on Grand Budapest Hotel, I'm doing things that are quite old-fashioned, like miniatures. Today, everybody would do it in CGI, but with Wes but some new directors, they want the old-fashioned things, and the approach is different. You have to go somewhere to places to see what is real. I mean, this example of that hotel in Karlovy Vary is that you never think that a hotel could be that pink. But if you are interested a bit in architecture and for example, on Isle of Dogs, for instance, suddenly I had to be interested in brutalism because we had a lot of European and Japanese concrete buildings to do. The approach, what is interesting, that it's not only coming from the art department who gives you things to do. I have, with my crew, I have to think about all this and to present some ideas how we interpret the ideas from the director and the production designer. In those years, there's such a confidence between Wes and us, which is great, because it's not a traditional way of, not an actual way of doing films. We just have moods, as we talked about, but no precise drawings. We do everything from scratch. Mm-hmm. And I like this work in the old-fashioned way, even if I have to do some more modern things with the big productions happening in Babelsberg Studios, for example. So it's a mix of all this.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that there's different hierarchies according to different productions, comparing maybe big blockbusters with maybe smaller independent films? Are there different hierarchies involved?
Oh, definitely. I mean, on a big blockbuster production, mostly Americans, you have to follow what is coming from the top. And you can give some ideas, but you need to be careful and to be sure that what you propose is really good, because otherwise you, as I heard before, you have all these different ideas, and unfortunately you have a lot of people having good ideas, but they don't know how to build it, how to manufacture it. Sometimes it's simple, but most of the time it's complicated. And even if I am a handcraft person, sometimes I say, no, do it digitally. On smaller productions, on low budget productions, you need to find solutions to make it as as cheap but as good as possible to make it good for the audience.
Mm-hmm. And Jacqueline, you were saying that you preferred independent films sometimes.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, I understand, you know, we're talking about investment, aren't we? We're talking about people putting money into things and, you know, projecting how successful something might be. I mean, I don't tend to do big, you know, Hollywood films. You know, that's not really. I also think I've been thinking about this and thinking it's not actually my personality. I think also because I really enjoy being part of the process of the making, the sourcing, the finding, the discussing. I love that there is a physical process to it. If you were to put me in an office and have me do meetings, that's not where you won't get the best out of me. You know, that's someone else, I think. And I feel that, I mean, my background is kind of fine art and theatre, and I think that has a central making to it, where there's the tactile quality of it is how you discover through the process of making. And I absolutely think that's what I do best, is by discovering through the process of making. And, you know, often that's really annoying. I mean, let's face it, if you want to know what a thing is going to be, you don't want to hear someone say, I don't know, I haven't discovered it yet. Obviously, it's like Simone was saying, you know, you need to be able to say, this is what we're going to do. It will work and it will be fantastic, you know. And sometimes to every bone in my body, I don't want to know what something's going to be. But of course, there is repetition. Of course there is. It's not like we're making installation art. We're not doing something that's without a sort of function and a form to it. So I think I love that independent film people are so surprised that you know, I mean, they are literally, they go, well, they're almost ashamed to start with, we've got so little money, you know, and you're kind of going, God, how are we going to do this? But in a way, and this is super annoying, but I find that also extremely interesting. It's like, I love to have restrictions. I don't want to have, well, when I say I don't want to, of course, you're just a goldfish that fills the bowl you're in, aren't you? So if you're given $2 million, you know, for your art department budget, I'm sure you'll fill that bowl. But I do think it's interesting when you go, how do we do this? You know, and I think in many areas, I mean, you know, right now in science, you know, people are going, how do we do this? They know there's ways of doing things, but they're also asking how and what if. And I think those are essential questions to ask in whatever field you're in. And I sometimes think that if you can always produce something and there's an easier way, maybe you won't ask those questions as much, but maybe I'm wrong, you know.
And Yana, you've got a background in theatre, I believe. I mean, does that give you a different approach to working within the team?
Yeah, I think it does, you know, because I worked with quite small theatre companies as well. I mean, I guess most theatre companies are a lot smaller than film production anyway. But so I think I always loved that sense of being like a creative family and doing things together. And with the really like low budget stuff that I did, I would, you know, direct and build the set myself with a few people and stay up all night, and and everybody knew about everything. Even like the production aspect and the financing and how do we get it all together. And I think I have that yearning to be like very involved with different parts of the process. So I think in some ways that's unusual for like the typical understanding of a scriptwriter, that you sort of, well, not, I mean, more and more people don't work like that as well. But I think some people in Germany sort of were trained, you know, that you just send your stuff and other people are going to take care of it. And I find that very often I make sketches for things just because it helps me figure out what stuff is going to be like, or I do a lot of like visual research, and I like to be on set. I love reading things out loud with actors, because in theatre we always did table reads, and we found things out by trying as well. Like the whole rehearsal process is so amazing, you know, that you act things out again and again, and by repetition you sort of find new nuances. And some of that I feel like now I do in my head, but some of that I also like to do like with actors and with people. And yeah, I think I think there's that, I have that strong yearning to have like real collaboration.
Mm-hmm. And Hanoi, you have some background as a director. Has that influenced how you approach the role of a writer?
I think so, even though mostly subconscious in the subconscious. But yeah, and maybe it's because of that I can this yearning Yana talks about. It sounds really familiar to me because I feel totally the same, and I think I can speak for Richard and Bob also, that we have we like to work in a group as a trio while writing, but also we like working with the different departments as early as possible. And even though the scripts are just in the first draft or something, we like to speak with the other departments to start a conversation about how could we realize that, and how could we find a vision that is as strong as possible for each project. And unfortunately, it's not so common, as Yana said before. In Germany, it's changing now a little bit. But when we started working, it was like, you finished your script, you send it off, and then other people did with it whatever they did with it. Now it's changing, and we got more and more involved in this whole process. This concept of showrunner becomes more and more important in Germany. And this is, it feels very good to be part of that, because then you're not just a writer, but you can also work together with the others. It has nothing to do with controlling the others or to be sure that your vision is transferred exactly on screen, but it's the joy of this collaborative way of working, and to think that a group is always better than an individual.
And is this something you intend to do yourself more?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Yana? Do you like to adopt the showrunner role?
Yeah, certainly. So like with a few shows that I'm sort of creating, developing at the moment, my own shows, I certainly hope to be as creatively involved as possible. Having said that, I have experience directing in theater, but I don't have experience directing like on a film set. So I think I'm also conscious that you have to sort of learn about a lot more sort of different parts of the process, so that you can be sort of a good leader and know, or if there are some things that you don't know yet, then you just, be open about that and say, what do you need, or maybe work together with the director. But I certainly have, I certainly have every intention to be more involved. Yeah.
And Simon, I mean, what kind of different relationships do you have with the director and producers? I mean, how often would Wes come on set? I mean, not on set, but in your studio, and the producers? Is it fairly a direct relationship?
No, to be honest, Wes is very discreet. We do everything via the internet and by email and phone. And on Isle of Dogs, he came one day in the studio, I guess. It was different because Isle of Dogs was made in London. We did a lot of models here in Berlin. It's a way of doing it. On bigger productions, you have these big meetings, and you spend a lot of time, like Jacqueline said, to discuss about a lot of things all the time, and you don't have always an interesting result. I worked in France, and that was very different, because most of the decisions were taken at lunchtime.
Brilliant. I love working in France.
We had meetings, but nothing interesting came out. And sometimes we met at lunchtime with the producer, with production designer and some other people. And then we made some drawings between the entree and the main plate. And we had a glass of wine, and then some interesting ideas came out. So it's a very different way in Germany, I guess, where we sometimes take only 10 or 15 minutes going to the catering to do that as quick as possible. And I'm missing sometimes the relationship between people, but that's very personal. Yeah, that's my idea of the different European ways of doing stuff. Maybe another time we can talk about Italy or Spain.
And your first production was with Terry Gilliam on The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. What was that like, working with him?
Well, that was interesting because I was quite young, and I had that opportunity because my father was a still photographer, and so he took me on that film. And as I was speaking some Italian and some English, they put me in the English special effects crew. But as I said, that was a great experience. At that time, I lived in France. I was on that very big productions at that time at Cinecittà. And I mean, Terry Gilliam was great because he was open to everybody. Even I was just a better intern in the special effects department. And I must say, that was it was a good mix between a big American production and a creative European, Italian art direction. And that, I mean, after 30 years, I must say that was one of the greatest experiences I had.
And Jacqueline, the production that you've just made, John and the Hole, can you talk a little bit about the background of the director and the writer and how their approach kind of differs to maybe other people?
Well, Pasquale Sisto, who is the director, an amazingly creative visual artist. And so what I found extraordinary about working with him was his sort of, I think we discussed this briefly. It was like I know this sounds an annoying thing to say, but I say it again the second time now, bravery. Because I think he's so used to the process of being a visual artist and so used to it's not always necessarily linear. And it's interesting what we're talking about, like mentioning a sort of slightly Northern European vibe, like, and kind of like the difference between maybe, like Calvinism and maybe Catholicism or something, like that there's a kind of, there's a sort of functioning and a lack of sort of making a big deal about things, that you've got to be, And I think that there's definitely needs to be space to discover stuff. And by that, I mean, to be able to discover what something is and what might be the best route for it, and to kind of audition it as well as auditioning actors. And so what I mean by that is that I think Pasquale, coming from a visual art background and being essentially so everything he thought and felt, I mean, he's one of the most inspiring people. Like, he'd just send you a text, but it would be something that made you think, like, not necessarily intentionally. I think it's just like hardwired. And so what I think that meant was made you question even just the process, which actually what you realize is you get so stuck into how do you pull this off, right? There's a short amount of prep time. This has got to happen. This is where the film's happening. That becomes very logistical quite quickly, I think, sometimes. And I think what was interesting about Pascal's approach was, yes, we had a huge amount of logistical challenges, but actually, you can still keep very creative and still keep thinking and approaching and going, wait a minute, is this? I mean, we were still finding locations up to like a week before shooting in them. And because they just weren't quite right. And it was really interesting. It was almost like a bit of a standoff where you go, are you prepared to hold out? And then someone else goes, yeah, are you prepared to hold out? You know, and like, you kind of end up going, look, we get one shot at this. And once we see it, what good is it looking at the film going, I wish we'd held out for that brilliant thing, or I wish we'd, God, wouldn't it, why did we accept that? It's too late then. And we all know how precious this is. You guys spent months writing something. And then, Simon, you must spend months making things, you know. And I mean, you know, I rewatched Grand Budapest with my mum recently. And we were just marveled at it, just like marveled at its beauty and poetry. And I think, God, you get so little time to pull it off. You just have to really go sometimes very close to the edge. And that is definitely, I think, creative people, and I say this hopefully with no one going, I don't agree, but I feel creative people are used to that feeling of not knowing, are used to feeling insecure, and are used to feeling quite kind of, and therefore they're maybe that little bit braver to go a little bit closer to the edge. It's like the cartoon where they run off and they keep running and then they run back on, you know? So I think that's my experience of working with both Pasquale and Nicolas, because I think he's a true artist. I mean, I know people say that and it's so glib, but I do think people that deal with great, big, hefty, difficult subjects are artists. They're not just, you know, I think it's fantastic. And I think that when you get to read a script where you go, it's mind-blowing, you know? So I think that's, I don't know if that answers the question, a bit rambly, but I think it was interesting to work with them both.
Yeah, so sorry, could you just mention what Nicholas's background is in terms of previous films?
Yeah, he wrote Birdman, so he wrote that film, and I believe there's a book he's just written. I can't remember the name, but I really want to get it. It wasn't. I don't think it was out when I last looked on Amazon, but I think his background is literature. I mean, he writes novels and books and short stories and things like that. But yeah, he wrote the script for Birdman, and I know that he's a friend and a collaborator with Pasquale for quite a while, and they had this idea of John and the Hole for quite a while, and then, you know, he wrote this script, and I think it was based on a short story, and then and then tentatively it sort of came together in that fragile world of American independent filmmaking, which is far more fragile than the UK. My God.
And Hanoi, you're working on Funeral, or you have worked on Funeral for a Dog, and it's a book adaptation. Can you describe the relationship between you and the author, and how that worked?
Sorry, who are you talking to about that?
Oh, sorry, Hannah.
Yeah. I thought, I'm not sure I know what that is.
You haven't worked on it.
Yeah, no. It's like, oh my
God. Well, it was good. We were befriended before, so we know each other for years and years, and it was quite a difficult process insofar as the novel is. It's not very plot driven. There's not so much plot in it. It's very introspective and reflective. And to make an 8-part series out of it, we had to invent quite a lot of stuff. And that was a hard process, as far as we had a lot of discussions, very long discussions. We developed this thing for about, I think, 3 or 4 years, from the start to until now. But it was always very fruitful and very interesting and very creative process to find something which is not in the book, which has got nothing to do with the book, but which kind of keeps the spirit of the book. And my duty was to always say, Thomas, we have to find plot, because we have to fill this 8 fucking episodes. And his duty was to say, okay, but I have to watch about to save the spirit of the book. That was it was very interesting and very hard, and I don't want to do it again in the next years because it was so hard, but it was good in the end. Yeah.
And has the have the opportunities in Germany increased in terms of what you can do in terms of TV series, or rather series, with the introduction of Netflix and Amazon, etc.? And I mean that was for Sky, I believe, but have things opened up?
Definitely, definitely. The stuff we're doing now for blogs or Funeral for a Dog or the new show we are developing right now, they would have not been possible 10 years ago. Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm. And Yana, have you found that it's possible to pitch more interesting projects, or have a bigger budget?
Yeah, I think that was sort of like a very fruitful kind of disruption or panic almost, when all these streaming platforms started arriving, because the traditional broadcasters were really afraid to lose audience, especially young audience. So I think it's not only that the new players are sort of doing different kinds of shows in different genres with different budget. It's not just them, but I think everybody else has also been sort of like shaken up and thought about, how they're doing things, what kind of stories they're telling, that maybe they have to be more innovative. Maybe they have to question some of their existing structures. And obviously, change is also like changing an entire industry is also like a process. And I wouldn't say that everything now is completely open and free. And I still find myself, for instance, having a lot of discussions actually about things like diversity, where I think like, God, shouldn't this be more obvious by now? But still, like you are having those discussions now, and I think on a lot of different levels, new things are happening. Different perspectives, different types of story, different types of genre. Yeah, like you said, also different types of budget. So it's a good time.
Mm-hmm. And what were the shows in Germany that changed the paradigm, showed people what could be done in television and series?
I think something like Babylon Berlin, like really sort of blew people's minds with the scope and like the visual excitement. But I think also, to be honest, like 4 blocks that Hanno did, kind of showing that you can really delve into a sort of story world that like previously was maybe just, you would have had some minor characters maybe from that story world, but to really, give that space and dedicate that time. And I think even in some ways, maybe Bad Banks also made some things possible in terms of like a mix of language and a kind of complexity, because I like a lot of people talk to me about like, it was amazing because I didn't understand everything, and I think German TV sometimes tends to be like very explanatory, like also in the dialogues, that everything, because and I still have these discussions sometimes with at broadcasters, that they're very afraid that the audience won't understand things. Like there's this assumption that people are really sort of either doing something else at the same time, like ironing their shirts for the next day, or not really listening, or maybe just a bit sort of like daft. But there's like really the assumption that you have to explain everything really clearly, and that stories shouldn't be too complex. And so many people said to me it was just like amazing because it was challenging, it was confusing, it was complicated, and they'd never, they hadn't seen anything like that coming out of Germany. Like obviously from other countries, I think you've had that level of complexity for a long, long time. But I think here it felt sort of like novel, and I'm sure there are a million other shows now that I'm neglecting to mention. But I think, yeah, there have been definitely things that felt fresh, and that inspired other people to sort of push the run off the cliff, like you said earlier. Yeah.
Are you allowed to say a few words about Tribes of Europe? I mean, what are you allowed to say about that series?
I'm actually not allowed to say very much about it, I'm afraid. Sort of like, yeah, more or less what, you know, what's been released about it so far is what it's about, so that it's set in the sort of near future, I think 2074 to be precise, and it's a future that is radically different to today's world. So Europe has actually sort of fallen into a number of micro tribes that are sort of, so it's also far less densely populated and sort of more archaic world, and they're sort of like fighting for survival and supremacy. And then you follow three siblings in this kind of almost odyssey, you know, to sort of find their way in this new world. But that's about it.
Who's it for?
That's for Netflix Germany.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for your contributions, and good luck with your next projects, and look forward to seeing what you're going to be doing next. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.